AsiA burst on the scene with their first record, went multi-platinum, and was very, very well received by a very, very broad audience. So it wasn't just the prog heads, it wasn't just the pop heads, it wasn't just the metal heads. Pretty much anyone who cared about good music more than elevator music or synth pop, which then was coming in. So they wanted a little bit more substantial, something with a little bit rock, jumped on this record because realistically, what's not to like? It's a little bit of everything. It's a little rock, a little pop, a little prog, not overly simplistic, not overly complicated, very, very well played. The players were pretty well known for the guys who were into Genesis and Yes and ELP, that neighborhood, right? The big prog. And the record is good. The songs are good, they're well written, they're well played, everything is good, sounds good. So major success. And of course you had John Wetton, who's like super charismatic. He has this stage presence, even though he himself is tends to be rather obnoxious very often and not nice to the fans. And they sold a lot of records. I forgot how much it was, but upon release, so within a short time from release, they went multi-platinum in different countries. So big success. And this was the time when the music companies, so the music publishers and producers and record labels and distributors and so on and so forth, were starting to become drunk on their own power. Again, pretty normal human response. And of course, when their next record, Alpha, only went I don't know what, less multi-platinum than the first one. I think that the rest of the world kind of rejected it faster than the USA. In the USA, it sold well, but not as well as they wanted or accepted or expected. So the record companies stopped to take them seriously and kind of dropped them as far as support goes, which is pretty idiotic, right? You can't expect a home run each and every time, but they did, and of course that caused troubles to the band. Besides that, of course, Steve Howe has a certain personality that's not really compatible with most other human beings, and so the clash with him and Wetton was pretty natural. He left, and after Alpha, they released Astra in 1985, which was not bad. Astra is really the record that should have been the follow-up to AsiA. Alpha was a little bit over commercialized, so that they simplified a little bit the songwriting. They raised the volume on the cheese, meaning the cheesiness of the songs, and they toned down the proggy parts. What's funny is that that Wetton famously said, and I think he said it on numerous occasions in numerous different interviews, that there isn't one formula for a successful album, which is a lie. It's not true. There is a formula. What isn't there is the guarantee that the formula will work and will be commercially successful, right? Very often, a lot of successful records are things that you wouldn't think would necessarily be successful, and there are multiple examples of that, right? You could say that Ozzy's No More Tears and the Guns N' Roses, the big record, you could make the case that no one saw it coming. It may or may not be, but there are records that you wouldn't expect to be Motorhead records. Again, I think they never really go platinum, but they do reach some notoriety. Case in point is that Wetton is not really being honest and not really telling the truth. Yes, of course, there is a formula. The formula is fairly simple. You want something cheesy and catchy and pleasant to listen to for the masses, and that's what pretty much all of the pop musical world, the music industry works on. That's what it is. You produce what you intend to sell, or what you think will sell well. But there is no guarantee that the formula will be successful. The market is crowded. There are a lot of bands. A lot of bands are good. A lot of bands are not good, but they still have a mass appeal, and so not everyone is going to get a home run every time. Case in point is that Alpha and Astra were very low selling or disappointing sales-wise. I think Alpha sold well, but compared to AsiA, to the first record, it didn't sell well. And of course, the trend continued with Astra, even though Go was a fairly successful hit, if I'm not mistaken, at least in the States. And the record is not halfway bad. The record is very listenable. It's sort of a step back, so it's really the record that should have been released as they follow up to AsiA, and then instead of Alpha, they could have done something a little bit more, let's just say, serious. So better compositions, less cheese, less happy-go-lucky, hopping, popping, kind of commercialized. But be it as it may, that pretty much signified the end of the band. The record label was very dissatisfied with Wetton. They sort of forced him out. And then they did a series of concerts in Japan, and GregLake stepped in instead of John Wetton, right? What an idea, like very parallel, kind of very similar guy, similar booming voice, even though the voices are very different, but they have kind of an authority on stage and the booming voice and the bass. So it was a pretty brainy. Whoever came up with this idea was quite smart. And despite that, the crowd wanted Wetton. So Wetton came back for a little while. They started the sessions for what would become the subsequent album, and Wetton left for good, as did Howe. And the only remnants were, of course, Geoff Downes, who remained for the entire history of the band, and he's the only one who is featured in each and every album and never really left, and kept the AsiA name and the AsiA band alive. And enter, instead of John Wetton, John Payne. And John Payne, as the name implies, would go on to have a lot of pains, and to be honest with you, it pains also me. I view John Payne as the one musician in rock and roll who got shafted more than anybody else. So he was there. He brought new blood and a new outlook, a new perspective, a new direction for the band. He worked very well with Geoff Downes. So if you listen to Aqua, I'm not going to say that it's a phenomenal, outstanding, incredible record, but it's a very good, very solid record. Definitely worth a listen. Has a very good consistency to the songs. They're very well written, very well played, very well thought out. So definitely worth a listen, even though it's not phenomenal, and even though it is, in some sense, a departure from the direction that AsiA were going, but that was really the more poppy, the more commercial direction, and they retained the more proggy, and of course they started to go darker. The next record, AsiA, made another step in that direction. So the music is kind of dark, the lyrics are not happy-go-lucky, I love you and I'm holding your hands and blah blah blah. They have some heavier topics, more of like people telling their own story of failure and pain and things of that nature. And one thing that really I notice about these records, that there is a very pronounced and obvious trend of I don't know what the right word would be, intensity to them, to both to the music and the lyrics and the singing, how they all work together. So very intense. Not super proggy. Well, they went with the next ones, with Arena and Aura and Silent Nation. They went in a little bit more proggy. One in Silent Nation, they scaled back a little bit. But good records, and really, John Payne and Geoff Downes struggled. They have a small audience, so it was always a struggle to get support bands, to get venues. but they kept marching on and soldiering on. So Echo was released in '92. Very, very good record. The only original members were Carl Palmer and Geoff Downes. With Araya, Palmer is gone, and of course Payne carries away from the previous record, and Geoff Downes stays. They had Al Pitrelli, who worked with quite some big names. If I'm not mistaken, it's gotta be Alice Cooper, and later on he joined the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, where I think he still plays, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a guy, Mike, I think the first name is Mike Sturgis, who was on the drum replacing Carl Palmer, and he stayed on for a couple records. Then they released Arena, which is even darker and a little bit more complex and more intense. So singing and playing from the heart, and the bass player, everything is pretty good. So they kept going into that direction. Then they released 2 studio albums only of outtakes and rarities, kind of from a lot of studio sessions and things that fell out even from the first records, and they were recorded with Payne, Archiva Volume 1 and 2. And then they had a soundtrack for a David Attenborough movie or kind of documentary about evolution and the appearance of life on Earth. And I think that only Downes and Payne were involved in that. Maybe they had some help from other musicians, but if I'm not mistaken, all or the vast majority of that record is MIDI programming. So some actual playing, but it's mostly Geoff Downes doing MIDIs and some live keyboards, and maybe Payne played an actual bass. I should have looked it up beforehand, but as far as I know, there aren't too many other actual musicians involved. Maybe some sampling. So kind of worth a listen. And then they come out with Aura, where Guthrie Govan gave the guitars, and he would join later on. And they had a whole slew of guest musicians, from Simon Phillips to Vinnie Colaiuta. Steve Howe made an appearance. I think that Carl Palmer came back for a track or maybe two. Pat Thrall, Tony Levine, who is of course from the famous with the Chapman Stick and King Crimson. So another very, very dark and proggy and complex album, yet retaining the poppy and the light rock element. Very, very interesting, very well worth a listen. And then they have the last album with this lineup, which came out in 2000 maybe, or 1999, I think in 2000, 2001 even maybe. Silent Nation. So from the lyrical themes perspective, this is the darkest. This is the first time that they release an album with a title that doesn't start with an A and end with an A. Well, they have Rare, which is kind of came out under Asia, but it's really a soundtrack, but a bona fide studio album. Broke now this let's just say tradition of releasing only things that start with an A and end with an A. They could have done all of the continents, right? They could have done America and Africa and Antarctica, but they didn't. I guess it would have been too much of a joke. They scaled back a little bit on the progginess in Silent Nation, so a little bit simpler compositions. I think that they were thinking of getting a broader appeal. But then, of course, the inevitable reunion happens, because you have the collaboration of Wetton and Downes that was rekindled in the late 90s, and they did Icon, and they had another name for that, but I think that this unofficial or semi-official name of their collaboration was Icon or Rubicon. Rubicon was an Icon record, or vice versa. Very, very good records, very, very special records. Kind of John Wetton / Geoff Downes solo records. Very, very well made together. They have a crazy appearance in actually in a church in England, where they played with one Dave Kilmister, who is amazing, phenomenal musician, who is kind of underestimated, not very well known. Very well worth a good listen and a good watch. So great collaboration there. I don't know what Payne was thinking or not thinking at the time, but be it as it may, in 2006, when the reunion was announced, in other words, the original lineup, Wetton, Downes, Howe, and Palmer, he was out of the picture, and they just kicked him to hell with barely a goodbye. And that's kind of painful. And I put the blame really on Downes. He could have, I think he could have suggested something, some sort of goodbye tour with maybe Wetton and Payne alternating, one doing bass and the other one vocals, and on the next song switching over, or Payne doing some Payne songs, or Wetton doing some Wetton songs, something like that, or maybe even recording a record together. But he was out. I have a sensation that it was Wetton who insisted on just erasing the memory of John Payne, which is pretty disgusting, but it was Downes who didn't stand up to him. Now again, we got to be careful. This is all speculation, so I don't know what happened between the scenes. It's very much possible that Payne himself was being a dick about it, or that he was demanding more than his power. So I don't know. Luckily enough, they kept the dirt, the schmutz, and the crap, and the ugly stuff under a lid. He did sue them because he had some rights to the name, and it went to court. Obviously, the court sided with the people with the deeper pockets, and again, the original members. So I don't know what the ownership was or how it was split, but they allowed him to continue appearing and releasing records under AsiA featuring John Payne, which is kind of stupid, right? Kind of like a Queensryche vibe. If I would have been in a position to give him advice, I would just say, take some money, whatever they offer you, and go away and start with a new name. But then once he either was forced or decided to stop using the name AsiA featuring John Payne, he went with Dukes of the Orient. Jesus Christ. If I wanted to, I couldn't have come up with a worse name for a band. If I said USB charger or glass of water, it would have been better. Unreal. Like sometimes people are so caught up in their egos and their emotions. Like what's Dukes of the Orient? I get it, Orient, AsiA. So just call it Orient or Oriental or something. I mean, what's lamer than that? Coming up with Antarctica or Africa, another continent name. It's just stupid. He should have just let it go and start his own band. And they did some pretty interesting stuff. Actually, on their last record, which also didn't have a super steady lineup. They had one lineup that did the majority of songs, but they had some stand-ins and guests. Was a guy by the name Shannon, I think Jay Shannon. He was the drummer, and he continued with Payne on. And they released a couple, I don't think that they really, maybe they did release a studio album or two, but they released mostly singles, which are very, very good. I recommend to check it out. There's Eye in the Sky, and the really, really good one is Seasons Will Change. Seasons Will Change is a phenomenal composition, and you see the musicians. Both guitar players are very, very capable, but one of the guitar players is excellent, is very good, and the drummer, the keyboard player is very impressive. So they did some good stuff. Unfortunately, from a commercial perspective, it went nowhere. So I don't know where Payne is right now, or what is he doing. He's hibernating, but it's a pity, because that dude had potential, and I think he could have and definitely should have get a little bit more exposure and done a little bit more in that realm, in that neighborhood. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I see some parallels between him and John Sykes. John Sykes is, of course, the phenomenal, amazing guitarist who was in Thin Lizzy and a little bit in Whitesnake and, of course, Blue Murder. And then he kind of just disappeared, wallowing in self-pity and anger and resentment to David Coverdale, because in 1987, David Coverdale screwed him over, which is true. But come on, get over it, be a man. They could have hooked up. Can you imagine John Payne with John Sykes? I think that although it sounds weird, right? Kind of the blues, rock, heavy metal orientation and mentality of Sykes with a little bit of that kind of virtuoso Yngwie Malmsteen / Eddie Van Halen, but he had more depth than that, really, Sykes. He also had his bluesier side, so I think it could have been worked out better. But again, Sykes, we just lost him recently, unfortunately. God bless his soul, rest in peace. But be it as it may, there are still musicians. So I think that Payne really should come out of his shell and try doing something. Success is not guaranteed, but the Payne era Asia and Payne's solo stuff, or Dukes of the Orient as he called it, gives me kind of a vibe, not so much from a music perspective, but the relation or the way that the fans related to it is like the Blue Oyster Cult and Uriah Heep fans, which I kind of call them twin bands, right? I sometimes say joking that the Uriah Heep is the English Blue Oyster Cult and Blue Oyster Cult is the American Uriah Heep. But anyway, the fans who like post 90s or post 2000s Uriah Heep and Blue Oyster Cult kind of give me a similar vibe to the Asia fans who like the John Payne era. Be it as it may, the big reunion happens, and of course they go back to something that's very similar to the first phase of Asia, the first record, really. That's what they concentrated on, and yet undeniably they did keep a big chunk, a big part of what John Payne went. So they threw away the poppiness and the happy-go-lucky, and they took some, not all, but some of the darkness and that kind of mentality in the composition and the approach to music with their subsequent records, right? So they came out with Phoenix, I think in 2006, and then Omega. Omega is very, very good. Heavy, I think it's their heaviest rocking record, most metal. They have a song that Through My Veins, amazing. And if you look to Through My Veins, there was a very, very strong John Payne era Asia vibe in there. But the rest of the record also. And same thing with Phoenix. And then they have Triple X 30 to commemorate the 30th anniversary. That kind of takes a step back a little bit to the poppiness and the happy-go-lucky, but not a big. So it's not a super commercial pop album, but it just has a little bit more brightness and upbeatness and positiveness, let's just say, in that perspective. And that they did Gravitas. How, of course, leaves again. I mean, again, he lasted one more record than in the previous run, right? So that's at least cool. So there's 3 records that they recorded with the same lineup. And then Guthrie Govan again replaces How on Gravitas, which takes an even bigger step towards the John Payne era Asia. And then Wetton is gone, and they just didn't continue. I guess they figured that it's no point in doing an Asia with John Payne, which at least at that point they could have invited him back, and maybe Howe would have come back. So the original lineup, just with Payne instead of Wetton, I think it would have been interesting. But again, since 2014, they did nothing. But Palmer is still around, Howe is still around, and of course Geoff Down is still around. So I'd love to see some collaboration, even if they wouldn't call it Asia or formerly known as Asia, something like that, collaborate and do a record, because I think that there was a big injustice done to John Payne. Again, like I said, I don't know what his part of the deal was, so he might have been, for all we know, the biggest idiot in the picture. I know he's very bitter and very resentful, but I don't know the little details. But anyway, a great band, and very, very worthwhile to check out all of the offshoots. So the Rubicon / Icon, I think I think that I detailed all of the titles in my old video from over a year ago, where I run down the discography of Wetton and not Palmer. I want to say GregLake. So John Wetton and GregLake, and there I think I detail title by title. I don't remember all of them, but there's 3 or 4 of them after Battle Lines. So Battle Lines is John Wetton's 1993 solo record, which is phenomenal, amazing, and the one from 1980 is also worth checking out, Crossroads. Really the best ones are the Icon Rubicon ones, and that specific concert that they had in a church in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. I'll put in the description if I remember, if I don't forget. But again, AsiA, great band, sad little history, like so many bands, that they didn't keep it together, and they made numerous mistakes over their history, but there goes. And thank you for being with me for this long, and I hope to catch you in the next one. And of course, until then, keep rocking on and on and on and on and on.